It's been a long day and very, very packed with very rich content with very little breaks in between. This session is scheduled to have 5 presentations. I'm sure there will be 4. For certain, we have 3 in the room with us now. One more person will be coming. The 5th person I haven't seen at the conference, Krishna Mazumdar from India, which is unfortunate because her perspective is always very, very interesting. This is all about index construction, model building. We're not going to be presenting data, but we're going to be presenting the process whereby one goes about constructing those instruments. And the first presentation will be with Brian, building a new quality of life index, and we'll be trying to do that. And then myself and Joe Sirgy will be presenting our work on advances in well-being based on the book that we just completed, which will be out in another month or so. And we'll talk about that. And then Kai is Yunji.
If you wanted to join, I will present.
You'll present, okay. Measuring community well-being, and I always know there's a splashy show associated with Kai's presentation. And the last one will be what constitutes well-being, and that will be Willem Deijl, who's not yet here. So let's begin with Ryan. Ryan, you have 10 minutes. Sure. And my awful job is to be time master.
You're the guy that throws the marker when we arrive at
And you have to
Okay.
and
Okay, all right. So I'm tethered,
Tethered.
which will be
Go for it.
which will be an interesting experience. I do not normally tether very well. So
Of course, if you speak loudly, you won't have to use
this
the
mic, yeah, I probably will not use the podium mic. So it's always interesting when you get put on a methodology panel as the person who doesn't have a lot of experience actually in the field that he's come to talk about. Primarily, I'm a public policy person. I'm mostly interested in how do we consider what public policy looks like, what does the evaluation do, and so I come to quality of life or well-being from a particular perspective, a perspective of how do we start to answer some of the questions. And what I'm going to present today is the result of a public policy conundrum that developed in the rural western United States, where there was a debate that emerged about how do you actually measure what's going on primarily with public lands issues to be able to actually engage in some evaluation that goes beyond simple measures of income. Because both sides of the debate managed to agree that the simple measure of income was inadequate, and they both keyed in on life quality as a potential way to get around it, but both sides were doing it relatively badly. They were simply making assertions in the public policy literature about what was going on, and at their root, fundamentally, one was claiming immeasurables essentially, and the other side was simply using proxies for income. They were simply using income to say its quality of life. So partly this work emerges out of a United States Department of Agriculture grant that ran for a number of years that we've been updating for a while now. But this is where we start. So this actually comes out from one side of the debate that emerged. This is from a group called the Sonoran Institute. They're an advocacy think tank based out of the southwestern United States who, beginning in the mid-2000s, started to do work focused on what's the impact of protected or federally owned lands on rural communities and economies. And as part of that, they issued this report, which was has a great name. It made a lot of splash. You've come a long way, cowboy. And as one of their sort of keys, they keyed on something that I think is actually true, although not terribly useful the way they start to describe it. And that is, the standard of living is not the same as quality of life. They're making a key point, because one of the points that they make through all of this study is that if all you do is take an income measure and call that success or failure of the public policy or the impact of federal lands, then you're missing something essential. And they suggest that what you should measure instead is quality of life, is how they start to talk about it, or at some points they actually go back and forth between well-being and quality of life, which unless you get well into this literature, you don't realize the difference. As a neophyte, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what that difference was exactly. But they start to mix these things up. And so one of the things that we started to think through was, well, okay, if both sides are claiming this, how could you actually begin to measure at a county level something that looks like quality of life? What would that look like? And so we took seriously the claims of both of the two sides. So to give you a sense, U.S. counties are the primary unit of analysis we were interested in. That tends to be where most of this work is done, dealing with federal lands. And we're primarily interested in it at the end of all of this as an explanatory variable because of its links to other things. Is where we end up, as opposed to it being the right metric for evaluating the public policy. What we find through this whole process is it may actually, instead of being the result of public policy, we find strong evidence, including some work I presented this morning, that it's impacting what's going on with public policy instead of it simply being the outcome. So here's usually a sense of the United States. Each of the little blocks drawn in there are counties. You get a strong sense of the division in the U.S. So if you move very far east of what the dividing line is the Mississippi River, and you move west, the geographic size of the counties go way, way up. Incidentally, the population density also, on average, goes down. And so we're interested in this level of analysis. In large part, we're trying to explain what's going on in rural communities, although we expand that to include all 3,000 counties by the time this project is over. And this also happens to be the most granular level where the data is reasonably available in any sort of sense that you can actually use and get a timely update. So we then sojourn into this part of the literature, again as neophytes, objective versus subjective measures. I spent the better part of my doctoral career trying to figure out this distinction. I still don't know the right answer, other than it's pretty clear what we're doing comes down pretty firmly on the objective side. Although I'm not certain, based on some experimental work we've done, that we really have anything other than a distinction without a difference. That if you're constructing objective measures reasonably well, you should be able to get consistent experimental results that people are at least thinking about. And again, this is all inside the U.S. context, pretty dramatic. So, sort of fast forward to where we get. So we end up with 5 indicator sections, what we call infrastructure, public safety, health, economic development, and education. I mean, these are nothing new. They're pretty consistent, pretty standard out of the literature. They sum up rather nicely. And we then say, so why an index? Well, you may also ask, why another index? There are a fair number of these out there. But there's not a lot that try to address the public, try to be usable for public policy, or that are focused on U.S. county level data like this is, where it's actually granular enough to ask some of these questions. So we're interested in the same things that any index will do: reliability, comparability, severability. So if you really think we're wrong about infrastructure, the way we build the index, you can pull infrastructure out and tell us we're wrong. Pull it out. We don't use weights in the data that we present, although you certainly can assign weights to them. We didn't have a good reason ex ante to know what those weights should be. And then we're interested in repeatability, all those sorts of things. And we use a very simple formula. It's not a new formula. It's been used by the UN. It's used by another project called the Economic Freedom of the World that we work pretty closely with on other projects. And it's just a scaling of the data. To take the data so it can be scaled together. Again, we use averages. We don't weight to create the end result. So now I can walk you through more detail the mechanism by which we go through. It's rather lengthy arithmetic.
Just
Yeah.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. All right, we're actually on track, my son. But what I'm more interested in, and I think which is the more interesting question, is less about how do you scale the data. That's a very simple process. And more that what we looked at when we were trying to measure public policy and actually be able to talk through this is there were 3 parts that we were interested in each of these indicators. The first was we used funding effort, which is an intensity measure, to say, okay, so what is the county, what are county governments and private industry spending in each of these areas? It's a proxy for production. Very simple. We're interested in the outcome. This one's pretty straightforward. What are the actual measurable outcomes that are happening? And then, is the service actually available across the counties? Now, you may think in the U.S., you would have relatively high penetration across these things, but it turns out there's a variety, especially when you move into the more rural parts of the country where service availability is low. This ends up having the least variability, the least variation of any of them, but there's still a fair amount there. So again, gives you a sense of what those things look like. And then to do that, we did a couple of different things to try to validate the index that we're in fact measuring something. We start with confirmatory factor analysis, and we get relatively good loading, consistent on factor 1. Seems to be something consistent there. But again, there are problems with factor analysis. You can be chasing an illusion. So we also do a principal components analysis to see coming out of the other direction. And again, we find relative consistency there. And then finally, we took these same things and adapted them to an experimental setting with about 1,500 undergraduates. Again, it's a convenience sample, so nothing, it's not fully randomized, it's not representative, but we get relatively strong results from the ordered logit as well that suggests that at least when students are reporting that they're working through these things, so we use a distraction exercise and then introduce, that these things seem to be mattering how they think about their own life quality. So with that, I'm happy to take questions or however you want to go through.
Let's take questions for students. I'm sorry about the press, but it's just the reality of.
Fortunately, I knew there were 5 papers, so the presentation was built to go through. And it also means that I can punt on any of the crazy stuff in the calculation.
We have time for a couple of questions or comments.
Sir, no? Yeah.
Okay, since you didn't finish the presentation, I'm very much interested in the conclusion.
Yeah.
So what's the conclusion?
So the conclusion is that as you work through all this, that on the first part is constructions of claims of public policy using quality of life as an outcome in public policy discussions. No one's actually using something that's measurable. They're chasing illusions. But on the other hand, when you start to consider what is determined in a variety of things, so things like voter turnout, things like decision-making in direct democracy elections. So now we start to move into my actual wheelhouse, this sort of political behavior, that we've often just dumped income into those to say, it's going to tell us something about it. And often it almost always comes back significant and important. But when you include life quality measures, you see a strong relationship between them. And so I think the sum up of it all is that what we thought was supposed to be an outcome measure, a way to really sort of do better public policy analysis, morphed into something that has explanatory power on the other side of the equation. So that's the grand sum up of it all. That having been said, it's not a very sophisticated quality of life index. It's a relatively rough cut. And yet it's consistent. So we've now updated this once with another round of data. So we started with 2 panels. And we've now been able to add 3 more, and we see similar direction, similar strength across.
But the data that you're getting is essentially census data.
It's census data, Bureau of Labor Statistics data. It's all at the aggregate county level. We can't say much of anything about individual life quality determinations. We can only talk
I
aggregates.
think it would be useful for people to know how many of those geopolitical counties actually exist.
Yeah,
there was a lot of blocks.
Yeah, there's 3,100-ish.
3,100
They
separate geopolitical units.
And there's this assumption that these things are relatively static in the U.S. You actually see they move in and out of being a county determination with some regularity, and creates a totally separate, interesting problem when counties merge and then unmerge over the period of 30 or 40 years.
Would you follow up? Why the county level and not, as I said, I mean, that was a whole bunch of cities and.
Yeah, so why county level?
Right.
So the short answer is that's where the fight in the literature we were looking at was based. Everybody was using county level data to try to understand the effect of federal lands. But it's we've had some success using MSAs because the same data is available. That it's you get a different set of data when you move to municipalities, but again, it would probably be relatively easy to adapt. But that was where the policy fight was occurring at the get-go.
Policy in relation to land use.
Federal land ownership.
Okay.
It's
So it's kind of restrictive.
It was very restricted from that point of view. But what I think makes it interesting for quality of life, this area, is that it's an approach to trying to deal with public policy that doesn't necessarily say you have to start with somebody else's index, but there's a way to try to structure the data to attempt to answer the questions. Now, we didn't end up there. We ended up with a totally different outcome, but it was a way to start to think through how public policy can be related to quality of life, which has public policy scholars don't tend to do that. We tend to run in fear of that notion.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
Joe and I, Sirgy and I are making this presentation. We have a total of 10 minutes between us, so I'm just going to talk for a few minutes, and then Joe's going to talk for a few minutes, then we'll take questions and answers. Essentially, he and I have just completed a 3-year project on the history of well-being. This is a history which traces the concept of quality of life and well-being over a full 4,000-year historical period, with most of the time spent on the regional analyses since the Second World War. But the first part of the book deals with conceptions of well-being in Islamic societies, in Confucian, Buddhist societies, and so on, to try and provide a framework for it. One of our struggles, as you can imagine, in carrying out a project of this type, was to determine an appropriate conceptual framework that would inform both that 3-year study and a second book that we're now completing called Advances in Wellbeing, which will be released probably around February. We'd stay on schedule. But they're both very related. The second book is sort of a cliff note summary of what's in the larger book, so they're very much related. Our issue was around the conceptualization models. We identified 60 different approaches to assessing quality of life and well-being from the period of the Second World War forward. And as you would imagine, most of the early models were economic models, which is exactly what many of us have been struggling against for the last number of years. That is, to not define quality of life or the sense of well-being using strictly economic metrics, recognizing that life is much richer than how much money you have in your pocket and so on. So we've identified those, and we selected 2 models that would inform the corpus of the body of work that we did in both the pursuit of well-being, the untold global history, and the advances in well-being. The first one was the weighted index of social progress, which is mostly associated with my work, with just the index of social progress. The second one is the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Health Wellbeing Index. Joe's going to talk about that. I will just basically describe what the index of social progress consists of. It's 41 indicators divided across 10 sub-indexes. And these are sectors, or sub-indexes, sectors of communal life that we've demonstrated over a period of many, many years to be the most important ones in terms of assessing quality of life and well-being. And I'm not going to get into the indicators that are used to operationalize it because we don't have time for that. But they represent the 10 sectors. This is the weighting system that's used. As you see, it was combination factor analysis and other methods used to come up with the item weights, the sub-index weights, and then the overall index weights put together in a very creative way. The methodology uses 160 countries, 162 it says there, and we have time series data beginning in 1970 for every 5-year period. So, and it's original data collected at the time from multiple sources. So we're now into almost 50 years of original data collection. It's a major source of information. Issues of missing data have been dealt with, and we can talk about that, and the time periods are also reflected there. The data sources are primarily United Nations. I should say they're country sources. Data provided by countries to international, non-governmental, or international governmental bodies that collect data in a coherent fashion. So the UN, the UNDP, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, all require member states to collect the same, to report the same kind of data using exactly the same set of definitions. What's been very interesting about the journey is that the breadth and richness of data has increased tremendously since 1970. More and more indicators have come online because we've been able to go into the archives and get data. And sometimes for whole regions of the world, for example, the Soviet Union, when it collapsed, we were finally able to get information on the separate member states, member republics of the former Soviet Union. And many independent scholars and non-governmental organizations. These are the 4 levels of analysis that the data are reported for. And this is what the data look like over that period of time, showing the decennial period and then region and the changes that have taken place. For me, one of the most important slides is this one, which reports progress in Africa for the first time, beginning in 2010. This is a dramatic shift that's taken place. I mean, Africa was in the doldrums, as you can see, fairly steady state for the better part of 40 years, but it's definitely launched and taken off in a very progressive direction at this point. And this is what it looks like at the global level using a single graph. And we have these graphs for each time period, so you can see the way in which the redness is dispersed, the pink the shades are dispersed around the world. So that's one method. I'm going to back up. Joe, this is yours now. The OECD. And if you want to just go into your slides, you create it, that's fine.
Yeah.
Maybe just, if you do just one. So,
We've got a whole bunch of indicators out there, and some of the popular indicators, Richard's social progress indicator is one heck of an indicator set that has quite a bit of data. It's very rich. It's very well established. Same thing with the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is also very rich, and it has continuity in the sense that we have a lot of trends and the like. The problem with some of the very well established indicators, like, for example, the Social Progress Index or the Human Development Index, and of course the OECD has its own index, is that they don't make distinctions between what some scholars talk about as outcome indicators versus action indicators. Action indicators are the kinds of indicators that ultimately guide public policy. Again, let me repeat that. Action indicators, which is different from outcome indicators. Outcome indicators are essentially, let me give you an example of this. This is the OECD framework of indicators related to health well-being. And let me make this distinction between outcome indicators and action indicators using their framework. And I think it's a beautiful framework because it has the potential of coming up with all kinds of other types of indicators and making those distinctions that would allow public policy people to connect the dots. And what are the dots? Outcome indicators is this: health status, life expectancy at birth, life expectancy by sex and education, mortality from cancer, mortality from cardiovascular disease, mortality from transport accident, suicide, infant mortality, and so forth, right? These are outcome indicators. In order to affect outcome indicators, you need action indicators, the kinds of things that impact those outcomes, right? And therefore, you know, action indicators based on much of the work that is done in health and well-being tends to be divided into three sectors: access to health care, quality of care, and healthcare expenditures. As a matter of fact, in any country, to assess the effectiveness, the performance effectiveness of the healthcare sector, you need to tap into these three. So in any country, when you say they have a good healthcare system, it's not necessarily that they capture this, they capture these. These are the action indicators. Action indicators because, again, what they do is they lend themselves to public policy action. Public policy action. Access to care, coverage for health care, unmet needs for medical care, unmet needs for dental care, and so forth. Quality care, avoidable hospital admissions, diabetes cares, and so forth. Healthcare expenditures, you know. So these things, right, affect this. But in order to be comprehensive, not everything that is impacted by public policy tends to affect those outcomes. So this is where this other thing comes in, which is non-medical determinants of health, like things that you don't have much control over, and you have to acknowledge and identify those. Tobacco consumption, alcohol consumption, fruit and vegetable consumptions among adults, obesity. I mean, of course, certain things you can do, and actually you can, well, we can argue that some of this connect with that, but nevertheless, this is something that you have less control over, and therefore it kind of it affects this in a way that may not necessarily be related to those action indicators. But what's beautiful about this model, this framework, is now we've got three main sets of action indicators. Now we can be a little bit more specific on what impacts those three dimensions of action indicators. And here the OECD spells out healthcare workforce and healthcare activities. These things affect access to care, quality of care, healthcare expenditure, and the like. And then, of course, there are these demographic shifts that impact those things. So healthcare workforce would be things like the overall number of doctors that are available out there, and they can break things down by age, sex, categories, and so forth. Medical graduate examples of indicators of healthcare activities would be, again, things like medical technologies that are out there, and again, those demographic shifts impact it. So again, what's beautiful about this is that we have a framework in which we're not only talking about outcome indicators, but we have action indicators, and this particular OECD framework allows you to connect the dots. Yeah, that's right. So, and I have to finish, but hold on, I have 2 other slides, but I'm not gonna go through them.
But we have a printout with them.
Oh, okay. So here we have a situation in which, well, let's do the same thing with something like employment well-being, right? We can actually come up with another framework that does exactly the same thing, in which we say, okay, well, income is an outcome, yes. We can talk about GDP and so forth, but we have to essentially spell out what are the things that we don't have much control over, and yes, we need to measure those. But again, comparable to the OECD framework, we can talk about access to the labor market, the quality of jobs, expenditures, you know, on economic development. These are the things that ultimately affect economic well-being, right? And what are those things that influence those 3 major dimensions, and again, we can spell those out. This kind of framework allows you to, again, connect the dots.
Why don't we take a couple of questions? Thank you, Joe. Hey,
So, a question for you, going back to the other slide, in terms of,
to the health
yeah,
well-being.
the health well-being, that is an extremely narrow view of determinants of health. What
The
happens?
OECD framework?
Yeah.
Wow.
What happens to access to public transport, access to affordable housing, access to education, which all influence these health status indicators on the side?
But that's no problem. What you can do is you can feed those other indicators in this framework. If you're not happy with those, and add or delete whatever you like.
But is that the OECD's?
That's the
Right.
easy, right.
How do they not take into account the other broader determinants of health? The social determinants?
Yeah. It's a valid question. Every model has a severe limitation. No question about it. This one is already very rich, very elaborate, but it does exclude those very things that you're talking about, that we know to be directly related to health in this case.
So when it comes to transportation, maybe you can add it, where would you add that? How does that fit?
Access to health, access to care. It's-
Access?
Yes, the 3rd column up top.
So,
It is so important, so that for them not to be there. would
Yeah,
be a real
it's
concern.
very obvious.
okay, access to this
But
transportation.
the conceptual model itself, showing the relationship between the inputs, the throughputs, the outputs, and the social investments, this is extremely valuable. But within that, you tinker with it to make it fit.
Yeah, just to add on that, another obvious thing that is missing is environmental factors. I mean, air pollution, water pollution, things
Well,
like
that's
that.
the
Number
uncontrollable.
of sun hours that you don't get depressed. I mean, this all has an effect on health, right?
Right, so you add those here.
Yeah, we should add those here.
Yeah, to environmental conditions.
Particularly because if you're going to do community planning and using a model like this, it's like all these factors are just externalities, you know, we don't account for them, we don't understand the link to them, so, you know, I find it really concern to me that the OECD would be like that.
Right, but there's also something to be said for parsimony. If you can't, you can't take into account everything because the model becomes overwhelming and then it doesn't become workable.
But we know theoretically that they are determinants. It's not like it's a thought, it's proven, it's evidential.
Other comments, or questions? And just be terribly mindful of time, that's all.
Is there empirical work to corroborate these associations and how important they are? And then if you have empirical work, you may know how much you are missing in explaining the outcomes with the inputs you have.
There is some publication related to the OECD.
At the empirical level, or this is basically
No, at the
conceptual?
empirical level. There is, this is the conceptual piece, but OECD always has backups in terms of, you know, that's one of the things those OECD is known for, is its rich empirical data. that are available to support this work. So they're there, they're online. I know from the Director General.
And a short question, may I, to you? If you were able to incorporate 3 additional variables to the index, and let's suppose that the information is available, what variables or dimensions would you incorporate now?
Variables or sectors?
Or sectors or something, additional information?
I would include
which is
the
not there.
family as a sector, a population group, the family itself, and a way of measuring family stability. And there are obvious things like divorce rates, family violence, and so on. But the data aren't collectible across all nations. And that was in the early model and was excluded. But that's one that I always had hoped to be able to put back in. So that would be the major one, I think. But covering 10 sectors is really quite a lot.
Ready to move on?
I think we have to.
Thank you.
Hi.
Now it's my turn. So first introduce myself. So I'm a psychologist and economist. My name is Ludwigs. I'm the founder director of the Happiness Research Organization, an independent research institute based in Seoul, Germany. So that's specified in measuring subjective well-being, happiness, quality of life using modern technology. And so I'm presenting here a project that we do together with the Community Wellbeing Institutes based in Seoul, Korea. So that was an idea that we developed 2 years ago at the ISQOLS conference in Berlin. And so that's here more like to explain the project itself, but especially to explain the state of the art of the project right now, where we are, and what the future prospects are. And so just, I think it's easier when I just show a video that we produced for that, so just to explain the basic idea at the beginning, and so just to give you a feeling for what the project is about.
Even in today's globalized and individualized world, it matters where you live. Better communities can sustainably change our larger society and improve individual lives. But what is a good community? And how can we enhance community well-being? The answer to these questions will differ from place to place, but nevertheless, it is possible to measure well-being in different communities to find the common characteristics. By collecting information on the various aspects of community well-being, governments and communities will be able to evaluate the actual needs of a community. The data collected are displayed online in a Community Wellbeing Atlas, providing insights on community well-being levels in different places. Are there communities that have significantly higher levels of well-being than others? And what can we learn from them? The Community Wellbeing Atlas is the scientific basis for developing policies that are focused on building better communities where people can live healthier, happier, and more meaningful lives. Our findings provide the necessary information for both citizens and governments to determine what a community really needs or wants. Would you like to share your experience and contribute to making your city a better place to live? You can do so by participating in our international study for building better communities. Community-wellbeing-atlas.com.
This is in the end like just basic templates, so that can be used like to attract participants. And so it's just like the basic idea, like just to explain the project itself. So this is available in Korean and German and English so far. So just like this video can be adapted then for different cities. And so the main idea what you saw is that the idea is to build in the end like just a more detailed database for community well-being, which is based on a more detailed measurement model than what was like other ideas before. So the idea is to differentiate first of all like clearly between community well-being and individual well-being, and so on the community well-being level to like to put in also like existing data sources on objective community well-being, to measure based on a questionnaire from the Community Wellbeing Institute subjective community well-being, as well as intersubjective community well-being. On the individual well-being way, it's the same way, also to add like objective markers, in the end like biological markers, so just to measure individual subjective well-being. Then to have subjective individual well-being, that's divided in the end in like general measurements based on the OECD guidelines, so just for measuring subjective well-being. On the other side, what you saw is to integrate to zoom into daily life by app-based measurements and to get information on people's time use and what we call it like on people's happiness time use. So at the end, how you perceive also like the time that you spend. And on the other side, to even ask people like just with an app, like just in the moment itself, just how they feel right now, what they do with whom and where, and experience sampling method. Okay, so that's kind of the measurement model that we applied in the end in the community well-being app, which is based on the happiness analyzers from our institute, just very integrated in the end this kind of metrics to build a basic app that we can apply for different studies. The goal, what you saw in the video, is in the end like just to really make also comparative analysis in the longer term, but especially to zoom into daily life and not just to abstract measurements of community well-being and subjective well-being. And so the other point when we do app-based measurements is that you can also get like GPS data, and so like this you can map in the end just things to see where people live in certain environments compared to other environments, and then to zoom in and understand things just on a more sensitive level to explain more and to help policymakers also to make more well-being-oriented policies. So one pilot, so that was kind of like the idea in 2014, 2015. So then we developed like these tools in the end first, the basic app, developed like a website for this, developed in the end just like the measurement model. And then there was a first pilot, so together with the TEDx community in Frankfurt, so where we just collected some data app-based first for a pilot in Frankfurt, and I will just quickly show you a screencast of that app that explains you the method, I think, in a bit more detail. Was that session 3? So the screencast explains you kind of, so people download this app, and so from there on they do first like a general questionnaire. So it's a community well-being questionnaire, asking for different indicators. And on the other side, they're then afterwards also doing a subjective well-being questionnaire. So about like 10-minute questionnaire. And after this, they do like one time a direct reconstruction method. So they define in the end like an episode of their day to reconstruct their day, and then in different answering options tell what they did in this episode, where and with whom. And so they do this for one day, and then they reconstruct and try to think about how they felt during this episode. So they do this for one day, like one-time questionnaire, community well-being, subjective well-being, and then one-time a diary, and then it's an important part. So like it's here the part that people get first the feeling, no, they did something social, so in the end for their community to give that feedback, but then they can decide for themselves that they're interested to track in the end their happiness in a more detailed way. By this then on the one side they get information for themselves, but also to give more detailed information that for the community and for policymakers, that there's a richer database for decisions. And so that's in the end what is then proposed. After you do the survey, that the app can in the end be adapted so that you quit the survey, or you do a basic version where you do like 6 more times like a diary, or an exclusive version where you do 6 more times like a diary, plus 4 times a day you're being asked like just how you feel right now, what you do with whom and where, what you see here, which is kind of like a notification. So where you're just asking and rating how you feel, and then again what you saw before and answering options, what you do right now, where and with whom. So that's kind of like the basic version of that episode that we applied in the end, and for different ways to attract participants. We have a website template that we can now like just easily adapt for different cities. We adapted the video that you saw in the end for Frankfurt. And in the end we got some first data, so the main result out of this was that living in the city center, so just in Frankfurt is quite pricey. That's new information, but the main thing is we were being able to see in the end in the time use data like really things that you would figure. So people that live in the city center need to work also longer, so they need to work longer hours but need to commute less. On the other side, people that live in the end outside of the city center need to commute more, but they also work a bit less because they don't need to make the same amount of money. So that's kind of like where we saw like just not in a representative way, but first like in the first data set that the idea itself really works out. And so we did other pilots like this in 2016. So for example in Bristol, in the United Kingdom, together with Werner Brouwer at the Purdue University in West Lafayette. So there's something running together with the mayor there. In New Jersey, in Kempton, there's a study now going to start. In my hometown in Hansen, Germany, we start something. Another town in Germany, in Herten, and there's a time use researcher in Santiago de Chile that's also going to try to adapt this. So for general pilots. But the main thing is that it's not that easy. It's not that you can just like put in the end like a video out there, a website out there, and put an app in the App Store, and you get just a bunch of data. So there needs to be a clear sampling plan, and so that's what we see also, like just when we just do it too simple and we don't sample in the right way and don't really figure out the details for a certain city, so then it does not really work. And there needs to be also reward plan when we really want to build like in the end long-term panels. And so for reward options, we were just giving it a lot of thoughts, and there are in the end like 4 options that you have to reward people for participating in the panel. The one thing that we have here is that it's individual intrinsic reward by in the end tracking your own happiness, and by this getting information for this. People seem to like to track themselves, but we see with devices like Fitbit and so on, and more and more. There's a socially intrinsic reward by sharing information in the end with policymakers, and by this doing something for the community. There could be an individual extrinsic reward by just paying people or giving them material rewards. And but the main thing is here it's about community well-being. So like this, our thought was to just have a socially extrinsic reward by donation budget, to not give people money, to give them in the end like donation rewards that they can donate in the end for community projects, which seems for us like a way more sustainable way in the end for rewarding participants. So that's in the end, last slides there to sum up. So that's the project that we do now in Wuppertal, a 300,000 inhabitants city in Germany. So where this is kind of a best practice that we prepare right now, so for building really a representative app-based long-term panel. So where here we were first having contact to the local university, sustainability professor there, Professor Schneiderwind. He had contact to the mayor, with the mayor and the professor we were going in the end to the biggest local bank to get like funding for the rewards, and to the biggest electricity supplier to have in the end like a good funding basis and a good marketing basis on really like promoting a study like this. And so in January 2017 it will start, and here it's not that people just do it for free. So in the end, the first 1,000 users will get each time when they've finished just the general survey of the community well-being questionnaire and the subjective well-being questionnaire, they get €5, like $6, $7 in the end for doing this. The main thing is they get this directly in the end. You answer in the end the questionnaire, and directly afterwards you're just being displayed different projects. For example, you rated that you're not that satisfied with the health situation or with the air quality, and you see a project in your community that you can donate in the end directly your funding to. And so that's kind of the idea to do this. The whole thing with the diary is something that's still like just that people can do. They don't get rewarded extra for this. It's just like an intrinsically reward. And so in the end, it's already like signed for this. That's there will be like 2 times a workshop. So like one time after half a year with the mayor and the public. Again, like just after 1 year, then completely, and it's going to be displayed in a dashboard for the public online, as well as for the mayor, for city planners in the end to use in the end this information for policy. And from 2018 on, it's then going to be a scale up to 5,000 people. And what we need to know is like when we do something app-based, it's for younger children as well as for elderly people. We can't really get that much data. So there will be interviews like added to get a really representative sample, and it will be connected when that's going to be funded again to a project from the OECD, a WebCozy project, which is has the claim statistics for everyone to really make sure that it's scalable in the long term for OECD nations. So
let's stop and let people ask questions which may respond then to.
Okay, so that's kind of the last slide, but I think that's also good to readjust and you're free to ask questions.
Questions or comments?
So how do you get this issue to subjective well-being?
So the subjective well-being is an idea from the Community Wellbeing Institute, which is in the end the point that you rate, for example, like the health situation. So just in your city, so the health services, you rate that for your personal satisfaction, and you rate that, you evaluate that in general for the residents. So like kind of you think about like just for others, apart from yourself, do you think that's a good thing, like in general also for poor people or for richer people? It's kind of difficult, and we still need to figure out a bit for this, but it seems for us like just as construct quite meaningful to also like figure out this part how you rate in the end your city and not just your personal satisfaction.
That I guess you call it a commercial, right? At the very beginning, you know, how do you use it? You actually, is that a television commercial or what?
So like in the pilot so far, that was just like being like put on Facebook and like just on, yeah, in the end. just general stuff. But so like for example, Wuppertal is going to be now like just also the local TV channels, so that's going to be linked and so on. Like it's in the end like something when the quality is okay that you can then also just put in TV and you don't have extra costs, right? So that is just then once produced. I think that's something important to mention. So like these are in the end like all like tools that we have produced, and they are really easy and without like much funding to adapt now, like for other cities, for other studies. That was kind of the whole idea, to really build like these modules to make sure that it's then like easily scalable.
We mentioned in an earlier session that a lot of the technology involved simply is not available for the vast majority of people. And I wonder if there are other questions or comments that are related to that, because this is very technology dependent in order to collect the data.
In other words, you know, also something to affect.
Another question. Much of the COVID stuff is very much driven by what we call hedonic well-being, right? And you know, when we're talking about quality of life or subjective well-being, there's a lot of other what you might call macro measures, be they monate measures, measures related to life satisfaction, which is a lot more cognitive than hedonic. Have you taken that into account?
So like in the end, like in the subject well-being questionnaire, it's like based on the OECD guidelines, which they differentiate in the end like regulation, eudaimonic and hedonic. So like this, like there we have these measures. So like that's all in. That's for example, like you can, I think you can still like put the construction method as well as an experience sampling method more like in the hedonic area. So like just that's definitely true. Like we did not put like additional indicators in, for example, for the data construction method so far, like asking if it was like a meaningful episode, for example. So that's something we don't use that much, like kind of in this layers. So like just there we are more on a bit more hedonic approach. But like for the general questionnaire, we are on more with constructs.
Rather than taking pull off just your question, I want to ask whether or not Willem and his team from the Netherlands is the last presentation.
Yes,
And we need to move to Willem.
All right.
Please, because we only have about 10 minutes now.
All right. I know I'm not finished already.
You're just starting. Forgive me for, please.
No. Yeah, so thank you very much. I wanted to start with 3 apologies, one of which is that I arrived yesterday, so I'm still a bit jet laggy, so I'm sorry. Another one is that I'm
You're in
actually
good company.
not really somebody who generally does empirical work, and this is an empirical paper. I generally, I come from a philosopher's background. So yeah, and related to that, I've never really done 12-minute presentations, and apparently it's down to 10.
10.
I feel like I wasted already 10% of my time. All right, so my paper is called What Constitutes Wellbeing? And so it's a study together with some health economists from the Erasmus University. So I'm quickly just going to go over some of the motivation of Yonji's paper, and yeah, we'll see how far we get. So we're starting with the motivation. So one thing that is interesting, at least to me as a philosopher, so my project is on the concept of well-being. So I think about that from a philosophical point of view, what it means in different kind of theories that we have about this conceptually. But what's interesting to me is that there's also quite some disagreement about this among researchers, but also among many people. So I think one of the things is that, so in this ISQOLS community, the subjective well-being concept is something that is quite central. But I think even about this, it's quite controversial. This subjective well-being concept is related to well-being. So I found a couple of views, for example, that are all a bit different. So some people say, well, you know, subjective well-being is simply something that's interchangeable with well-being. We use well-being as a subjective concept. So subjective well-being is something, yeah, is what it is. Other people see it more as a proxy, not really as a direct measure, but more as a proxy to well-being. And other people even say it's only one dimension of what well-being really is. Perhaps it's an important one, but it's only one dimension. So in policy applications, often well-being is understood more multidimensionally. So for example, the OECD's How's Life Index is multidimensional. The Sirgy report was multidimensional. I know from the Dutch Statistical Office that they have a well-being measure that's multidimensional. Of course, these also depend on whether they incorporate maybe more personal factors, more personal viewpoints. So the Dutch one is extremely objective in this sense. They're only based. But for example, the OECD has a subjective measure as one component. And lastly, also something that interests me, so is the capability approach. So they have a conference actually next week in Japan. And so they also so well-being is also a controversial subject in that field, at least substantively. They don't really agree on what it is or how you get there. So for example, you have this idea. So they have a multidimensional view generally, but part of them say, well, it should be the philosophically informed index. So Nussbaum has an index, or at least a list of things that she thinks is important. But other people say it should be a democratically informed process that informs what well-being really is. And so that's sort of the motivation behind this project a bit. And so what the question is that I attempt to answer in this paper, in this empirical project, is, so what are people's conceptions about what really makes up well-being? And so why would we do this? So one of the things is I think that's simply interesting, and I think you can argue that to some extent these empirical questions, they should be motivated, or should be informed with these kind of knowledge about what is it that how people conceive it. But there's also a more normative viewpoints. For example, Daniel Hebron and Valerie Tiberius have published this paper in which they argue that from a policy perspective, if you're going to do well-being policy, it better be the kind of well-being that people think that it is. And so there's this normative idea behind this. The methodology that we use is also kind of uncommon. It's sort of like a semi-quantitative methods, and it's called Q methodology. And Q methodology was developed by Stevenson, and it was a colleague of Spearman in the 1930s. It's very old, but it always it's always been sort of like in the background. It's not very mainstream kind of methods. But people use, so it was developed to measure subjectivity, and it's becoming a bit more popular to do these things to measure. So in fields of research that try to get at subjectivity, it hasn't really been used so much for well-being, but I think a couple of people have tried this. Basically, you develop a set of statements. And so you ask respondents to rank these statements somehow. I'll show you how this works a bit. And then sort of you analyze the communalities between not these statements themselves, which you would do normally in many statistical methods, but among the people. So you see if there's maybe common viewpoints. That's sort of how it works. And you use as a factor analysis for this. But yeah, so non-standard. So normally you would do a by-variable factor analysis, but we do like a by-person factor analysis. And so we try to describe and interpret these viewpoints. And what we use for that is, so we kind of use a qualitative methods. So we've asked people to describe, so we ask people to explain their answers. And we use that in order to interpret the kind of things that we find. And so a by-factor analysis, like I said, so normally in a factor analysis you would sort of look at the variables and see how the variables might have something in common. It's a very simple picture, of course, but now we do it, so we turn it around. We look at what people are. So in a sense, it's weird in a sense because what you get is something like a factor you get is like a person that's somehow typical, that describes a number, that might help describe a number of people. And that might seem strange, but yeah, it's the idea behind it is that you get something like a typical person that describes a particular kind of viewpoints, and that every actual person somehow is a combination of these different viewpoints that you have. One thing that was kind of important for us is like how do you get at the potential things that people can rank, right? So, but what's interesting about this is that there's actually a lot of well-being lists, and they come from different fields and different points of views. And we simply tried, and what's interesting is that they tend to have a lot of stuff in common. So things that we looked at were, so from the capability approach literature, we looked at a number of lists. So some of these were highly philosophically informed, like Exel badges, objective lists. But we also looked at Nussbaum's one. But also from a more empirical or human development perspective, you have these lists. So for example, the OECD one, and a number of different ones. And what's interesting is that, this is only a small part of the graph that we use, but we looked at, for example, one dimension which is almost included in every list, which is something like physical health. And that's, so you see it's almost in every list has something that's very similar, that looks a lot like that. Yeah, and in the end, so we needed to break that down a bit. So we got these, I think, 11 different dimensions. That's everything that we got. But we broke those up into different statements because we wanted to. All right, we wanted to look at that. So okay, we wanted to make it more concrete, basically. And statements like that is, so for example, physical health gets chopped up into prospects of many years ahead, so something like life expectancy, but also healthy lifestyle, being able to do your physical activities. And so this is the kind of, so we made these little cards, and yeah, I'm sorry, that was one. And we didn't, actually, so this was an internet exercise, I'm sorry. But we asked people to place all these statements in a ranking like this. And that's what we analyzed. So it goes from 1 to 9. In the end, we standardized it saying that this is 0, and it went from +4 to -4, but that's just for our interpretation, that would make more sense. So different viewpoints, really quickly. Basically, so we looked at the additional data to get it. So we basically found 4 distinctive viewpoints, and we also found some general results that were, I think, interesting. So one of them is that, so we had something like political representation in there. So concretely, something like how important it is that you are being represented in things that are important to you in your life. And this was ranked like incredibly low by almost everybody. And the same account sort of for spirituality. But interesting enough, there was a very small, it was a small part of the variation that was explained by spirituality, and it ended up being due to a small group of people that were very spiritual.
Who did you ask? I mean, who's in the sample?
Yeah, so this was like a Dutch population, and it was sort of like a relatively well represented sample of the Dutch population. It ranged, I think, from teenagers, a couple of teenagers, until very old people. Thanks. Interesting enough, maybe for people who come from a hedonic, who like hedonism, is that so mental well-being, something like this, is what we called it in the end. It's a bit of a translation issue. We call it a little bit differently. Dutch was more hedonic, but so that was ranked quite highly. So that was the most important thing. But also health was seen as something that's really important to well-being as well. And we find also large variations with respect to maybe social relations, material well-being, and also spirituality. So maybe one of the things that I kind of want to look at is that, so we found in the end 4 viewpoints, we give them names. So health and romance, security and health, autonomy and spirituality, though that one might change. So doing that back. So I just wanted to give a very quick impression of what it looks like. So basically what we did is that, so we looked at, at each viewpoint basically is made up out of one of these things, which is called a Q sort. So we fill it out again with particular common viewpoints. And the things that were ranked really highly in, so the health views, so this was in a sense the one that explains the most variation, was health. So health is considered very important in this one. And you can see that, so the prospects of many years had was one of the statements was ranked highly in these particular viewpoints. And these were a number of things that were considered very unimportant. And what's interesting is that if we looked at the interpretation, we started to see, we look at, so people who scored very highly on this particular viewpoint, what kind of things they would say, how they would explain their choices. So for example, a particular person said, so we asked them, so explain in one sentence what is a good life, or something like that. The good life for you, tell us what it is. And they say something like growing old, in good health, having a good relationship with my husband, children, and other family members, a nice and relaxed life in a good environment. And so if you look at the importance of health, it was both, some people really looked at it more instrumentally, the things you can do while you're healthy. So it seems obvious that everything else is futile if you do not have the time to live. So really the life expectancy idea of health. But there were also people who thought it was something really important in itself. So being healthy is the highest good. When you feel fit, you can handle everything.
Let's take a couple of questions and maybe we'll be able to cover some additional content.
Yeah, all right.
And
yes.
I do apologize for this. It's an impossible situation, given the limited time. Comments or questions for please.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but someone from the audience just asked, did you also involve teenagers, both teenagers and adults?
Yeah, it went from 16, I think. It was the youngest participant, but we only had a couple of them.
What's your point of view of adolescents having different point of views on good life than adults?
Yeah, it's a couple of things can be said about this. So the first one is that, relatively speaking, I was surprised with how little that mattered. So like, in a sense, it seemed to be relatively robust to age. That was one thing. But we looked at it only in a little bit. We didn't include it in the paper. It's a good question. On the other hand, there's of course also a little bit of an obvious point that for somebody who's very old, you have a different perspective on health. And that of course it does make a difference. It doesn't. And that's interesting in itself if you think about how we think about it. How you should do it. Thanks.
Don't you think this is an exercise in futility? In the
No.
sense that there would be a huge variation between age groups, between people who are diseased versus disabled versus normal versus, my goodness, if you break down the population in so many different ways, you know, that different domains would be, certain domains would be much more important than others.
Yes.
And here what you're doing is you're making an assumption that applies to all. Would that be fair?
So I agree with everything you said in the middle. I just don't agree with the fact that I'm making an assumption about anything, and I don't think it's futile. But so I think that all the things that you said in the middle that made it interesting to me. But please maybe you can explain what assumption I'm making that makes this. So perhaps just to clarify.
Again, those different life domains are universal, and essentially they are equally important for all.
No, but I think it's an interesting question to ask. To what extent they are.
But you need to do a whole lot more further analysis based on some sort of a segmentation, and the segmentation possibilities would be enormous.
Yes. No, that's true. Thanks.
Yeah, I like your point of starting from the bottom, which is actually the process starting with people rather than with a mental framework, a mind framework, and trying to understand from people what is well-being. No? I guess what you have here are stated preferences, because people are expressing a preference over a set of choices to provide, which is restraint. That's your theoretical bias. What dimensions to include and what dimensions are not there. That could be important. But the point is that probably it would be very useful if you try to explain what, or try to do research on what explains their preferences. Because actually probably well-being is that factor that is explaining or providing like a justification for the preference they express. It is not the preference, what you see, but the process they use or the information they use to make this choice. That is actually what explains people's preferences. They are looking for good for them, for the family, for whatever, and that goodness they are looking for when they express preferences or make choices is actually the well-being they are looking for. And these choices are the factors they believe are important, that make a greatest contribution to well-being.
No, I think But so is there? There wasn't a question, right? This was just a comment.
It's like a comment, but maybe to study the process or the fundamentals that these people use to make preferences. That's actually, if you assume that people look for well-being, whatever it is, then you will understand what well-being is. If you understand how they make choices and the fundamentals that are behind these preferences.
No, that's definitely an interesting way to look at it. So one thing, of course, that's very difficult. So I agree in a sense it's very close to a preference exercise. One thing, of course, that's very difficult is that people cannot really actually choose. They don't really ever make. Well, they make choices that are maybe like this, but you don't really get to choose many things in this list, right? Like having a good, yeah, at least it's kind of difficult, right? So people don't really choose generally between being maybe physically healthy or having a good romantic relationship. What is more important? I think it's a difficult exercise. But apart from that, I think it's an interesting way.
We're going to have to stop there. It's 4:25, and there are other sessions starting at 4:30. Executive committee.
That one, yeah, but that's for
Thank you very much. Everybody. Thank you all. Gold stars. We go to 108.
Yeah, but yeah. Yeah, but it's really being worked right now. But I can send you one home.